At the beginning, no one realized that it was already happening. There was no announcement, no visible failure, nor any sign that could be classified as an emergency. The planet kept spinning, the sky remained in place, the seasons stayed recognizable. Everything seemed normal enough for most people to continue living without adjusting anything. Even so, something essential had changed, not in the planet itself, but in the relationship between it and those who lived on its surface. The first changes did not appear in global sensors, but in human decisions. Projects were postponed without clear justification, scientific expeditions planned for years were canceled in silence, territorial expansion systems, which had previously advanced automatically, began to encounter inexplicable administrative resistance. It was as if collectively no one was certain anymore that moving forward was a good idea. Kálior was not rejecting anyone explicitly, it simply stopped making things easy. Regions that had previously accepted construction began to present small, constant problems. Nothing serious, nothing worthy of evacuation, but always something. Soil that gave way a little more than expected, a water system that required continuous maintenance, a climate that never fully cooperated. Living there became tiring. At the same time, other areas seemed strangely receptive. Small communities prospered without excessive effort. The environment seemed to tolerate their presence as long as nothing was demanded beyond what was necessary. This asymmetry began to draw attention. There was no political, economic, or cultural pattern. The difference was not in who occupied the space, but how they occupied it. Where intervention was minimal, the planet responded with stability. Where there was an attempt to dominance, friction emerged. The word response no longer seemed adequate. This looked more like preference. Scientists resisted the idea. Preference implied intention, and intention was a dangerous concept when applied to a planetary system. Still, the data insisted. It was not punishment, nor chance. It was selective adjustment. Kálior did not need to expel anyone. It made permanence unviable only for those who insisted too much. Axis 0, still active, intensified this effect without realizing it. Created to dampen excesses, it reduced natural variations that had previously allowed adaptation. By making everything too stable, it eliminated margins of error, and without margin for error, any human interference became more visible, more heavy, more uncomfortable to the system. The planet did not react with violence, it reacted with functional indifference. The deceleration continued, not abrupt, not dramatic, just constant. Each cycle was slightly longer than the previous one, differences too small to generate headlines, but large enough to alter deep biological rhythms. People began to feel this in their bodies before understanding it rationally. Sleep changed. The perception of time became strange. The days seemed to drag on without urgency, as if the planet itself were diluting haste. Some called this planetary maturity, others collective fatigue, but the most attentive perceived the real pattern. Kálior was reducing the pace of everything. Less speed meant less impact. Less impact meant less risk. It was a simple, elegant, inevitable strategy. Civilization began to reorganize in response, not by decree, but by convenience. Difficult regions were gradually abandoned. Infrastructure ceased to be maintained. Routes became obsolete. Entire cities entered an ambiguous state between existence and memory. They called this spontaneous reorganization. In practice, it was retreat. There was no organized resistance because there was no clear enemy. The planet did not attack, it did not threaten, it did not demand anything. It simply offered less space to those who insisted on occupying too much. Cultures began to change. The idea of growth lost strength. Grand projects began to sound misplaced, almost offensive. Ambition was replaced by adaptation, not because someone decreed it, but because any other path seemed to generate too much friction. The future stopped being imagined as something bigger. It began to be imagined as something smaller, contained, possible. Some celebrated this as ethical evolution. Others felt a discomfort difficult to name, because although life continued, something essential was being abandoned along with expansion. The sense of protagonism. Kálior no longer needed to be saved, and by all indications, it no longer needed to be understood. It only needed less. Fewer people, less interference, less insistence. The question that began to emerge, still without clear form, was simple and disturbing. What if the planet was better off without an expansive civilization on it? Not as a moral judgment, but as a systemic calculation. Complex systems always eliminate unstable variables when under pressure. Civilization had become a difficult variable to predict, and Kálior was correcting that, not with catastrophe, not with extinction, but with continuous reduction. Meanwhile, most people continued living normally, working, raising children, planning the next cycle. The planet was still spinning, the sky was still there, everything seemed similar enough not to provoke panic. But the available margin for error shrunk every day, and silently, civilization began to learn how to fit into a world that no longer needed to accommodate it completely.
Collective perception did not come as a shock. It came as gradual acceptance. When it became clear that some regions simply stopped functioning well, no one spoke of forced evacuation. There were no alarms, no dramatic announcements. People simply stopped trying. Maintenance was postponed. Recovery projects were archived. Living there became a constant effort, and little by little, the effort stopped seeming justifiable. The planet did not expel, it tired. This fatigue spread uniformly. There was no specific day when everything changed. There was no central event that could later be remembered. It was more like realizing too late that something important had been diminishing for a long time. The deceleration reached a curious point. It was no longer just measurable, it was felt. The human body, accustomed to regular cycles for generations, began to react. Sleep fragmented. The perception of the passage of time became imprecise. People spoke less about tomorrow and more about enduring one more cycle. The future lost sharpness. This change had profound effects on culture. Narratives about progress disappeared silently. Films, books, speeches stopped imagining larger worlds. Stories began to speak of permanence, adaptation, containment, not as a conscious choice, but as a reflection of the environment. Civilization began to think small, not for lack of intelligence, but for lack of symbolic space. Kálior no longer needed to be interpreted as a hostile or benevolent entity. It did not seem interested in judgment. What it did was too simple to be called intention, but too organized to be called chance. Kálior adjusted probabilities. Where there was excess, resistance emerged. Where there was containment, fluidity emerged. Where there was insistence, friction emerged. Over time, this logic became impossible to ignore. Governments began to plan settlements based on environmental compatibility, a technical term that hid something deeper. It was an indirect way of admitting that the planet accepted some forms of presence and rejected others, not because of who they were, but because of how much they demanded. Axis Zero became viewed with growing discomfort, not as a villain, but as a symbol of an old mentality. It represented the attempt to keep the planet stable by force, even when stability was no longer desired by the system itself. Even so, no one shut it down. Shutting it down meant assuming risk. Keeping it meant comfort, and comfort had always been easier to justify. Meanwhile, entire communities disappeared without drama. They were not destroyed, they were abandoned. Empty houses, roads without traffic, systems shut down due to lack of use. There were no heroic ruins, only accumulated silence. The landscape changed without fanfare. In regions accepted by the planet, something curious happened. Life seemed simpler, less efficient perhaps, but more stable. People learned to live with the environment, not despite it. Not because they were morally superior, but because any other behavior became unviable. The planet did not teach, it conditioned. The idea that Kálior was choosing stopped sounding absurd and began to sound inconvenient. It was not something that could be fought with arguments. There was no way to convince a planetary system to change its behavior. It did not listen, it adjusted. The deceleration crossed another almost imperceptible threshold. Calendars needed to be corrected again. Nothing that affected daily life immediately, but enough to confirm the pattern. The planet did not intend to return to its previous rhythm. Even if all artifact were removed, even if all interference ceased, Kálior had learned another state of balance, a state safer for it. The question that had once been philosophical became practical: how to live in a world that no longer needs you as before. Some answered with resignation, others with creative adaptation. There were those who tried to resist, insisting on large, ambitious, almost nostalgic projects. These projects failed not through sabotage, but through constant friction. They cost too much, demanded too much, faced too many obstacles. The planet did not destroy them, it made them unviable. Over time, even the most resistant grew tired. There was no glory in fighting a world that did not attack. There was no victory in insisting when the cost was always greater than the return. Civilization shrank, not immediately in number, but in impact, in reach, in systemic relevance. Kálior kept spinning, slower, more silent, more stable, and perhaps for the first time since the beginning of the crisis, completely indifferent to the idea of being inhabited by an expansive civilization. The last deep analysis made by the oldest scientists was clear in its coldness. There was no prediction of total collapse. There was no final event. There was no end of the world. There was continuity. A continuity in which the planet continued to exist, healthy within its own parameters, while civilization learned to live in a secondary role. Not as protagonist, not as dominant force, but as tolerated presence. And perhaps this was the final destiny of every species that tries to control too much the environment that sustains it. Not to be destroyed, but to be reduced to the margin. Kálior did not need to explain anything. It did not need to justify anything. It did not need to respond to anyone. It had chosen its own stability, and civilization, too late, began to understand that not every choice includes everyone involved. The planet was still spinning, but now it spun like something that moves forward without looking back. If the planet is choosing, not everyone will continue to be part of the story. Subscribe to the channel to follow the next episode. Like the video if this idea kept echoing in your head. And watch the continuation, where civilization will need to decide whether it tries to prove that it still deserves to exist here, or whether it accepts living as something secondary in a world that has already moved on. Because the end does not always come with destruction. Sometimes it comes when the world continues, without needing you anymore.